Just a week before her wedding, I overheard my privileged sister and my boyfriend making out. I became so upset that I announced her engagement. I assumed he had disregarded it, but on the day of the wedding, he made a major announcement. My sister, 26-year-old me, and my boyfriend, 29-year-old man, were involved in a sticky scenario. I saw that my sister was behaving strangely toward my boyfriend just before her wedding. In the beginning, it was subtle things that made me uneasy. It all began with some casual remarks. No matter how bad things were, my sister would always say things like, every time he said something, she couldn't help but chuckle. Initially, I attempted to dismiss it, reasoning that she might simply be acting extra cordial due to the wedding anxiety. Subsequently, though, I became aware of others. She began to look for opportunities to touch him inadvertently, like placing her hand on his arm while they were conversing or accidentally bumping against one another. Though understated, it was noticeable. When he wasn't looking, I saw that her gaze lingered on his for an excessive amount of time. It gave me the willies. I made an effort to broach the subject with my partner. I brought up the fact that my sister had been extremely flirtatious at a family meal one night after we came home. Have you observed Sarah's behavior this evening? Excuse me, I inquired. Confused, he appeared. Can you explain? I detailed my observations. The giggling, the gesturing, the glances. His response was a simple shrug, albeit he did listen. According to him, you're making too much of it. The wedding is likely the only thing that has her so giddy. It poses no threat. Still, I got the impression it wasn't harmless. Something seemed odd, and I couldn't get rid of it. Perhaps I would be mistaken, so I resolved to keep a closer watch on things. Tensions rose during the next weeks. I felt the need to keep a close eye on my sister whenever we were in her presence. The number of insignificant things that irritated me increased. If given the chance, she would sit right next to my guy every time. Despite my presence, she would always find a way to ask him for assistance with wedding-related chores. We were having a family cookout at my parents' house one day. My sister and my boyfriend were chatting softly in a corner of the yard when I returned from using the restroom. They stood side by side, and my sister couldn't help but laugh at something he said. My sister and I were separated in an instant as soon as we spotted one other. I was ill with dread. There was a part of me that wanted to confront them then and there, but I was trying to keep the peace at the family reunion. I opted to wait until we arrived home that evening instead. Earlier, you and Sarah were discussing. In the most casual way possible, I asked my partner. He seems taken aback by the inquiry. Simple wedding details. She wanted my take on the playlist. Furrowed brow erect. So that's why you had to stand so closely to one another, huh? Please. Not this again, he moaned. I already informed you that nothing is happening. Sarah's only trying to be cordial. I just couldn't help but say it. Good-natured, what are you doing? She's virtually hurling herself at you. Expression of pain crossed his face. To what end are you directing me? You're related to her. I'm doing my best to treat her kindly. I told her, you could set some boundaries. Because telling her to leave isn't an option. You may just say no and walk away. But I'm not interested, he adamantly stated. Nothing has to be clarified. You're perceiving the unseen. Our argument fizzled out after a while. He insisted I was dreaming, and I couldn't get him to acknowledge what was crystal clear to me. We were both furious and upset by the end, so we went to bed. Direct communication with my sister was something I resolved to do the next day. To see if we could have coffee together, I gave her a call. While seemingly unconcerned with my worries, she enthusiastically consented. At a little cafe close to her apartment, we met. My hands trembled a little bit as I stirred my coffee, a sign of my nervousness. As my sister joyfully discussed wedding preparations, she failed to perceive my unease. At last, I had had enough. I cut Sarah off in the middle of a thought we really should discuss this. My grave tone startled her, and she glanced at me in surprise. Am I mistaken? I inhaled deeply. While mentioning my boyfriend, I made a comment about how you've been acting around Tom recently, including your flirting, touching, and gaze toward him. It must cease. Her expression shifted from astonishment and uncertainty to outright wrath. What on earth are you referring to? Her demand was strong. No, I haven't been trying to get Tom's. It was my firm belief that you had. Perhaps you aren't even aware that you're doing it, but it's really unsettling me. It wasn't a joyful sound, but she did laugh. You are acting really foolishly. Tom is like a second family to me. Lolita, I'm merely being cordial. I clarified that it goes beyond that. There's no end to the ways you justify being close to him, even touching him. Even his terrible jokes make you chuckle. Your actions are crystal clear. She turned red in the face, and she added, I can't believe you're accusing me of this, particularly when it was said just before my wedding. Is that the extent of your insecurity? I continued despite the sting of her remarks. Respect, not insecurity, is at stake here. You must come to a halt as you are about to cross a boundary." Without warning, she rose from her seat, making a ruckus as she scampered to her feet. "I refuse to sit through this," she declared. "It's absurd and paranoid of you. If you can't trust your own sister, that's your problem. Not mine." I sat alone in the cafe while she stormed away. Shame on me. Had I erred in my judgment? Had I gone completely crazy? My boyfriend was waiting for me when I returned home. Upon my arrival, he immediately sensed that something was amiss. "So, what transpired?" he inquired. Recounting my discussion with Sarah, I informed him of it. His expression seemed increasingly worried as I continued speaking. He let out a deep sigh as I concluded. "This is happening just before Sarah's wedding, and she is going to be devastated." There was a defensiveness in me. "Are you now siding with her?" Instead of saying anything, he just shook his head. I refused to take a position. "What I mean is, I don't think Sarah was trying to show me that she was interested in me." My eyes started to well up with tears. And that's even if she was, which I seriously doubt, because I knew this wasn't the right way to handle the situation. So now what was expected of me? Toss it out. I felt his embrace as he walked over to me. "You should have spent more time discussing it with me. Perhaps try approaching Sarah with a more constructive tone. The wedding is going to be a total disaster now that she's likely to be furious with us." Separated from him, I withdrew. "Does that mean I'm completely to blame?" As before, he let out a moan. "No, I never said that. You might have been a little too dramatic, in my opinion." We continued to bicker, but it was obvious that we would never reach a compromise. At some point, he turned in for the night, and I was left to ponder my alone. Tensions rose during the next days. There was silence from my sister. Inquiring as to Sarah's source of distress, my parents phoned. I felt like I was overreacting, too, even though I tried to explain. The big day was approaching, and I was at a loss for what to do. I wasn't sure if Sarah still wanted me to be a bridesmaid, even though that was my original role. To prove there were no ill will, my partner suggested we both attend, and the invitation was still on the table. However, I felt nauseous at the prospect of seeing my sister's wedding procession while I knew how angry she was with me. Sarah never picked up the phone, no matter how many times I called. I left multiple voicemails expressing my apologies and requesting a conversation, but she never returned my calls. She still wouldn't let me into her apartment, no matter how many times I went there. My anxiety level rose as the wedding day drew nearer. Everything would blow away, my partner assured me, but I still wasn't convinced. I dreamed that the whole wedding was staring at me as they pointed and whispered in my ear. Out of the blue, I awoke. The situation escalated following my altercation with Sarah. My mother was enraged with me after she informed our mother about my claims. Just before Sarah's wedding, she yelled at me over the phone, accusing me of being narcissistic and paranoid. "Can you believe you're accusing your own sister of something so heinous?" Her demand was strong. I attempted to present my perspective, but she remained unresponsive. She insisted that I make amends with Sarah right now and tidy up this situation. We could hardly stand the stress in our household. My parents were also furious, and Sarah still wouldn't talk to me. I felt even more alone and irritated since my partner, Tom, insisted I was exaggerating. I visited my parents' residence 1 week prior to the wedding in an effort to mediate any conflicts. I could make out muted sounds coming from around the corner of the house as I walked up to the front door. Inquisitive, I made my way to the garden, where my jaw dropped in horror at what I beheld. Sarah and Tom were there, partially concealed by a big plant. They were passionately kissing and held each other. As Sarah's legs around his waist, Tom's hand dangled beneath her top. They were completely absorbed in one another, completely oblivious to my presence. It was as if someone had punched me in the gut. I was speechless and unable to move for a second as my lungs emptied. A surge of wrath and betrayal then overcame me as the truth of what I was witnessing became clear. The fuck is this everything? It was a scream coming out of me. With expressions of shame and disbelief, they leaped apart. Sarah's complexion became white as Tom began to stutter. Although it was just what it appeared to be, it is not what it appears to be. It was as if all my darkest thoughts and fears, which everyone had previously written off as paranoia, were validated overnight. I don't see how, could you? Tears were flowing down my cheeks as I coughed out. My brother-in-law and my lover Sarah also began to cry. "My deepest apologies," she cried out. This was not what we had anticipated. Unfortunately, I found their explanations intolerable, ignoring their cries for me to return. I swiftly made my way to my vehicle. My phone began to ring as I drove away. My mom came last, followed by Sarah and Tom. I paid them no mind. Upon returning home, I gathered a bag containing necessary clothing and items. I messaged Tom. "That's it. Stay away from me from now on." My next move was to silence my phone and go. A hotel room in a neighboring city is where I am composing this. What should I do next? I have no idea. I will be unable to attend the wedding at this time, even though it is just a few days away. My sister's infidelity has severed our connection, and I fear it will never mend. Everything has been flipped upside down for me. I was absolutely correct in my suspicions, yet everyone treated me like I was insane for having them. After this, I will never trust anyone again. So, Reddit, I would greatly appreciate any guidance on how to proceed from this point onwards. Refresh the memory. My sister Sarah's encounter with my now ex-boyfriend came as a shock. Hello, Tom 4. Several days I was completely disoriented and unable to make sense of what had transpired. Both of their numbers, along with my parents', were constantly popping up on my phone, but I just couldn't bring myself to answer. I came to the realization that Mark, Sarah's fiancé, was the one person who should have known the truth. I contacted him with a heavy heart. There was obvious perplexion in Mark's voice when he responded. My goodness, what the hey? According to Sarah, you vanished and refused to communicate with anyone. I drew a long breath and spilled the beans to him. After laying out my original suspicions and the dismissal of my concerns by others, I went on to describe what I had seen in my parents' yard. Mark listened quietly while I spoke, breaking his silence only to make a noise now and then. There was a considerable pause when I finished. Mark finally spoke, his voice calm and collected. The information you shared is greatly appreciated. Allow me a moment to consider this. Before ending the call, that was his only statement. I couldn't help but stare at my phone, consumed by curiosity about his potential actions with this information. Mark and my family remained silent as the wedding day drew near. By the time Sarah ceased attempting to get in touch with me, I thought she had gotten Mark to forgive her. It sickened me to think that she would get away with it, that her life would be perfect while mine was in shambles. The wedding was not on my agenda. Knowing what Sarah had done, the prospect of seeing her walk down the aisle was too much for me to handle. But I had other plans for the day. I wanted to be alone and think about how to fix my life. Unfortunately, my cousin Emma called me on the wedding night. She spoke in a low, enthusiastic tone. This is unbelievable, you have no idea what has transpired. Perplexed, I inquired as to her meaning. Emma started telling her tale. So initially, it appeared like everything was fine. As Mark stood at the altar, Sarah radiated beauty in her gown. But when the vows were about to be exchanged, Mark stood up and announced something. As Emma went on, my pulse began to race. Everyone was informed by Mark that he was unable to proceed with the wedding. The idea of marrying someone who would wreck her sister's life by betraying her and getting entangled with her lover was too much for him. The color paled out of Sarah's face. Please understand that I feel it is important for you to be aware of the true reason your daughter has been avoiding you, Mark remarked to your parents. Then Emma continued by describing the mayhem that broke out. A flood of tears poured down Sarah's face. The visitors began whispering to each other, and my parents' expressions changed to one of shock and confusion. Sarah was left sobbing at the altar as Mark allegedly left the chapel. Emma remarked that it felt like she was in a movie. The shock hasn't worn off yet. Sarah is being uncooperative while your parents try to get her tale straight. My mind was blown. On one hand, I was relieved that the truth had been revealed. On the other, I felt terrible about the suffering this would inflict on my loved ones. Feeling all right? Upon my inaction, Emma inquired. I responded honestly, I really don't know. This is the last thing I expected. I spoke with Emma for a little longer before hanging up and sitting in quiet contemplation, attempting to make sense of things. We now knew the truth, but how much did it hurt? I had severed ties with Tom and Sarah, and now my whole family was in disarray. The truth had emerged, but it wouldn't solve all my problems, I knew. The process of healing and reestablishing trust would take a long time, a tiny sigh of relief. Nevertheless, had not been handed over me since this entire situation started. Now that the burden of whispered facts has been lifted, I can finally begin to go forward. I am uncertain about what will happen next. Even though I know I'll have to confront my family at some point, I'm just living day to day at the moment. If nothing else, I've learned that it's crucial to follow my gut and defend my independence, no matter how much people try to discredit me. I am grateful to everyone who stood by